Another thing is the nation, of course, is very rural at this time for the most part, and our church is very urban. So by 1829, we're depleted and in dire straits, and what revives the church is an evangelical movement and a movement towards mission, of taking our message out into the world. Some of the guys that were very involved in that were John Henry Hobart, who really grew the church in New York. Jackson Kemper, who started pushing the church out in the West as the Bishop of Indiana and Missouri and then Wisconsin and Iowa, establishing churches in the Midwest. Absalom Jones, the first African-American priest in the Episcopal Church, really starts growing the church from a different direction. William Muhlenberg was involved in something called the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral, which was an ecumenical movement to bring churches together. And then that becomes another hallmark of our tradition, ecumenism, reaching out to other traditions and trying to find ways to connect with them. So there you go. All right. As we get into the 19th century, the Oxford movement becomes an important part of the church. Anybody know anything about the Oxford movement? So as I said, the church, huh?
Tracts.
Yeah. The church that came to America was very low church, so churches had very few accoutrements in them, and the Oxford movement is a movement to come back to the more Catholic tradition of having candles in church, of having clerics wear vestments, and those kinds of things. So that was very influential in the church in the 19th century. But mission was our big thing. There were Episcopal missions by the 19th century to the Far East and Africa, and then later to China, Japan, Mexico, and the Philippines. So the growth of Anglicanism in the world did not really come out of England, except for the countries that they owned and controlled. But the actual mission movement came from America, at least in those areas. In the latter half of the 19th century, there were discussions around liturgy because of that Oxford movement, and it definitely influenced the church. And one of the main things that came out of that was the social action of the church, and that's where we really, so by 1850, that's when we're really getting much more concerned with caring for other people outside of us and taking care of them. Women became, as usual, the main movers and shakers in that movement. We had a whole group of women who weren't ordained called deaconesses, and they were big in creating the Domestic and Foreign Mission Society and for creating the social gospel in America and reaching out to people. I don't know how many of you have heard of Hannah More, but she started the education system in much of America. I went, exactly, so it's telling you we grew up in the same place, about Hannah More Academy, which is right down the street from where I grew up, which was the only place to go to school then.
For girls.
For girls, yep. So,
And where's that?
in Reisterstown, Maryland.
So she started education for women?
She started education in general, but she
Really?
created academies for women. Yeah. Yep. So those are the things that we're becoming most involved in, and by the early 1900s, that became the hallmark of the Episcopal Church. Social witness, reaching out to people in need, foreign mission to foreign countries, and ecumenical cooperation, figuring out ways to be in communion with other denominations. And that became our three major deals. Okay? So by the beginning of the 20th century, the church moved from certain death, from our attachment to England during the Revolution, to becoming an integral part of American life. And some begin to see it as the most important American church. Don't mishear me, not in numbers at all, but we became leaders in many, many ways in this country. As you know, during that period of time, up through the 1960s, there were many Episcopal presidents. Most of Congress was made up by Episcopalians. I'm not suggesting that was necessarily a good thing, because some of those folks were Episcopalians only in name, because it was the church to be connected to have the right connections, but all that was moving. So that's the direction the church is going. And then two other major events in the world right before this started influencing us majorly. One was in 1859. There was a deacon in England who wrote a book. Anybody?
Date again? 1859?
A deacon in England.
Oh, yeah. Way, really?
Okay.
Origin of the species.
Now, it's hard for us to imagine just what happened in the world as a result of that, but there were riots in the streets. I mean, people were just crazy, okay? And the other one was the biblical criticism movement that begins in Germany, where we start looking at the Bible as a piece of literature and criticizing it and doing it the same way, like Fenton does every day with his students here, with every book. We started doing that with the Bible, and people got very upset about that. But those two things not only did not bother us as Anglicans, but we embraced both of them, because we saw it as ways to learn more about our tradition and where we were going, while other religions at the time want to throw both of those things out, to the point where some people start breaking away from seminaries and start creating their own seminaries, so this doesn't get taught there, and biblical criticism doesn't get taught there. Okay? Okay, so we get to the Civil War. The Episcopal Church is the only church in America that does not split during the Civil War, for better or for worse. I'll make your own decisions about that, but every other church split, north and south. Southern Baptist, American Baptist, South, North, Presbyterian USA, Presbyterian PCA, this is what they're called now, North and South.
Lutheran.
Lutherans into the synods.
Missouri Synod.
And the ELCA church. Every other denomination, Protestant denomination, split in half but us.
Not the Congregationalists, I wouldn't think.
Yeah.
They did?
Congregationalists,
Really?
everybody's did.
Steve,
Yep.
that reason comes into play there, probably big time, and I think you're gonna talk about it later on, when you talk about how broad we are,
Right,
because we didn't split, we just got broader.
exactly.
Exactly.
So the Via Media played a big part in that, that we didn't split during this process. We want to hold everybody together under the big tent, which I believe is a lovely thing, but not when it gets to the point where you're not taking a stand about the issues in the Civil War. So, okay? All right, so do with that what you will. In 1946, the first full-time national leader, our presiding bishop, Henry Knox Sherrill, he became elected for the whole church, and instead of just being a bishop somewhere, he became a national figure, and as the presiding bishop represented the whole church. He served as the first president of the National Council of Churches and the World Council of Churches, back to our ecumenical movement again, and so we become in the 1940s and 1950s, a very, very important church in America in so many ways and growing tremendously. And that's, from 1946 to 1960, became our period of greatest growth ever. And that stopped in 1960. Why did that stop?
Yes, why?
Civil rights.
Civil rights movement.
Because we finally took a stand. So civil rights began, and we became the church that took a great stand in the civil rights movement. So churches like in the South, they started leaving in droves. They just left. And the church really starts addressing African American issues. John Hines, the presiding bishop during the time, makes social activism the central role of the church. He said that we will consciously devote our efforts to black concerns, and we did. So churches start leaving in droves, especially in the South.
Episcopal churches
Yeah,
left the Episcopal Church,
left the Episcopal Church.
and they just went and did their own thing, or
Yes, most of them just went and did their own thing. Yep. The next big issue of contention, of course, was the role of women in the church. I'm embarrassed to say that the first women that we had serving at General Convention in the church was 1970. Yep. But once we got on this social bandwagon here, we made it happen pretty quick. In 1974, one of the most important dates for women and for many of us in the church happened. What?
ERA amendment?
Well, what happened in the church, though, was what we now lovingly refer to as the Philadelphia 11, where we ordained 11 women as priests in the church before it was approved by the National Church, and we just did it anyway. And then at the 1976 General Convention, it was approved. So we already did. Yep. So whole churches left in that process too.
Oh, yeah.
As soon as women got ordained. Prayer, they're still leaving. You're right. Anton?
Steve, thank you. This is even better the second time.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt, but I have play practice.
Yes.
But I have 2 tickets to the Verdi Requiem at 3 in Centennial Hall, if anybody wants them.
Wow.
oh my gosh.
Yes? Yes? Okay. Karen and Laura,
There you go.
right here.
Thank you, Anton.
Okay, bye-bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Nice.
We get to see Anton in the play Saturday. Oh my gosh.
Oh, I love it.
Have those churches,
So back to the women priests.
have
Yep.
those churches formed some kind of other group?
Not at this time. That will happen in the next affection, which we'll talk about. And when churches left, then they just did their own thing. Yep. Yep. Okay. So we get into the 1970s. After women become ordained, prayer book revision becomes an important thing. We finally get this new prayer book in 1979. By 1980, on one of those Pew research things, the Episcopal Church is found to be the most progressive of 23 religious denominations on the question of racial justice. So that just gives you an idea where we were in there. 1985, Edmund Browning was elected presiding bishop, and Edmund became famous for his main line, which was no outcasts. There will be no outcasts in this church. He says diversity is our strength, and we just push the social gospel to the ultimate at that point. To give you some,
What was the date?
1985.
Okay.
Okay. In 1991, the Episcopalian George Bush, who was president at the time, was preparing for war with Iraq, and Edmund Browning, the presiding bishop, asked him to reconsider. That's the kind of influence that we were having at that point in the country. 20% of Congress at that point was Episcopalian. Okay. As we've gone forward, you know that the next battle became over homosexuality in the church. And once again, as we embraced gay folks in big numbers and became very adamant about that, we had more churches leave the denomination. And that is when folks started defecting and calling themselves something else. So in recent years, so the first movement there, what happened was, when churches tried to leave the Episcopal Church over women's ordination and gay people being full members of the church, including being elected bishops in the church, the movement to break away started in Virginia. It was a very the idea, not that that's where the biggest part of the movement was, but the idea was those churches were incorporated before 1670, before we were a nation. So the thought process was, we can take the whole building and take it away from the Episcopal Church because it wasn't part of America. And so it was a brilliant strategy. It failed in every case. They have not gotten one building yet as a result of that. But that was the strategy in those days. So parishes began that broke away from the Episcopal Church, affiliated with churches in Africa, who also are struggling with gay folks in the church. I don't want to get into polygamy. Yes, I do. So these are the same churches that, of course, the folks are polygamist, and we kind of turned our head about that because we saw that as a cultural issue in the church. But now that's turned around the other way, and I partially get that. I see this as colonialism and us forcing them to see things our way, and I partially get that. But what congregations did was affiliate themselves with some of those African parishes. So now you have to be really careful, because if a church calls itself Anglican and they put Anglican on the sign, they might mean that they're one of these breakaway churches affiliated with the African.
Like the one out on.
And that's different than
Yeah,
Anglo-Catholic.
like the one on Ina Road.
Yeah, St. Bede's.
St. Bede's.
St. Bede's on that
I've
road.
been wondering what
And
that was.
if I understand you correctly, Anglo-Catholic is different than Anglican. Is that right?
Well, Anglo-Catholic is just a term within the broad framework of Anglicanism.
But Anglican, is that a term, is that an umbrella term under which Episcopalian falls?
Yes. Yes. So the mother church is the Anglican church. And all churches, and some churches within it call themselves Anglican, some call themselves Episcopalian
And yet,
throughout the world.
and yet we don't all call ourselves Anglican.
So that's the difficult thing now. We are all Anglicans. I mean, we are part of the Anglican tradition. We are tied to the mother church as Anglicans. What's muddying this water is a little bit are these congregations that have affiliated themselves with a church outside of America, and they're calling themselves Anglican, even though they're not part of the Episcopal Church. It's a little confusing.
What does Desmond Tutu think of that?
Well, obviously, he's not very happy about that on lots of levels. But that's where
He's
we are.
an Anglican archbishop.
Yep. Yeah, in South Africa. Right.
Yes.
It's the Nigerians where the
Yeah.
real issue is. Yep.
Okay.
Carol?
Well, after just moving here from Virginia,
Yeah.
when that movement of the homosexuality issue came in, living in Virginia, what we really saw was that the churches became Anglican or Episcopalian in
Yes.
Virginia.
Yes.
And so, and that was where, and if you said you went to the Anglican church, then you were against homosexuality.
Right.
And if you were for it, then you went to the Episcopal Church. So there is a great divide in Virginia specifically, where Anglicans don't want to think that we are really, that Episcopals are really part of the church.
It's actually ongoing right
It is
now.
ongoing.
I mean,
yeah.
within the last 2 years, the church we attended in Virginia had people leave because the bishop put out a questionnaire about
Yep.
that very subject, and the priest of our church at that time took a certain position, and people didn't agree with it, and they just left the church.
Yep. Yep, it's very much still happening. But let me tell you a little bit about that vote at General Convention when we elected our first gay bishop, and when we elected Catherine Jefferts Shorey as presiding bishop, our first female bishop, both of those things.
What year?
So Catherine was, what is
They
this?
just finished 9 years, so let's see,
So that
this is
This
18.
is
That was
2009.
2009?
Thank you, 2009. There's this, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the polity part of the class, but the thing that I love about our General Convention, and we're going to talk about what that is and how we do it, is, you know, we come from all parts of the church. We gather, it's the largest political body in the world when the Episcopal Church gathers to make resolutions at General Convention, which happens every 3 years. But when we took those votes, there was this sense of history that was in the room. I mean, it was so palpable. You could feel it. And you knew that you were voting on something that was going to change the world forever, not just this church. And you could not help but know that you were going to be a major part of history and changing the way the world operates on some level. And you could just feel all that in the room. But we voted, and the people that voted against it voted their conscience and voted the way they thought we needed to be as a church. And it was the way they understood our tradition and our biblical connections. And they voted that way. And when the vote was over, we stopped and we were just quiet for like 7 minutes, where we just sat there with this. And then we got up, we sang a hymn, and then we went and hugged everybody who voted against this. We sought out everybody and hugged them and came together. It was one of the most powerful things I've ever experienced. And I truly believe that that's how the United States form of government was supposed to work. You know, and I saw it happen in this room when people had this had this sense of faith and history behind what they were doing as they did this. It is one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever had. So that's not in my notes. I just wanted to share that.
Thank you.
Just amazing.
Thank you.
So. Okay. What else? What other questions do you have?
Was it a close vote?
It was not a close vote at all.
God.
It was over 80%. And the vote was even, so you know, we vote in 2 houses, just like in the United States government, House of Bishops and the House of Deputies, which is half priests and half lay people. And the deputies' vote was even higher, a higher percentage than the bishops. It was approaching 90%.
So what was the scriptural or theological foundation for ordaining women and gay people?
So there is no scriptural basis for ordination. It's not in the Bible. There are no priests.
Right,
There are
yeah.
no priests in the Bible. Okay.
What was the theological?
So So the theological premise is straight from Jesus.
Yes.
Who did Jesus welcome into the church? What was Jesus' main goal? Was to bring folks into the church that were being isolated in society and oppressed in other forms. That in the early church, people that were running the church included women in many churches. That they were running house churches. So we saw historically the ancient roots of the church being based actually more in women and Mary Magdalene, and the fact that Jesus came to women first, and that the men never got it, certainly influences all of that theology.
I like that part.
So that was a big part. And then on the gay issue,
Yeah.
there are 8 references to homosexuality in the Bible. 8 of them. 8! In the whole Bible.
Not 3,000?
And I would suggest that all 8 of them are not about homosexuality as we understand it. It is certainly not about a committed relationship of 2 people. It is mostly about pedastry, men with boys, and other things that were issues in the first century world and before.
Aren't they still, when it comes to molestation, wasn't it about forced sexual relationships? I've read that.
Yes.
It had nothing to do with
And it's always
homosexuality.
about abuse.
Abuse.
And
yeah.
that's why Jesus, gosh, don't get me off of this. That's why Jesus says something of being against divorce. Because what happened to a woman in the first century if she was divorced? She had no way to live. She had no way to do anything. It was all about keeping people equal, egalitarian.
Control and
Barbara.
So if you flip the question around, what was the rationale for not ordaining women and
Interesting
LGBT
question.
people?
Uh-huh.
Right.
Because there's a long tradition in the church of women not being ordained, and that there's nothing that we can point to in tradition that says that women should be ordained because they haven't been before. And those same 8 points in the Bible, that it says in the Bible that homosexuality is wrong. Yep, it was the exact same argument. Yep.
So we've gone over all of this history.
Yep.
What are pressing issues for the church today and looking forward in the context of this historical precedent?